Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our Parliament for Researchers Exploring Select Committee Evidence training session. You're really welcome with us for the next hour. My name is Naomi. I am part of the Knowledge Exchange Unit at the UK Parliament. The Knowledge Exchange Unit supports and strengthens the exchange of information and expertise between Parliament and the research community. We do that in various different ways. So we run training, we provide lots of online resources, we promote opportunities for researchers to engage and contribute to Parliament, we run academic fellowships, and we are a point of contact for anyone who wishes to engage with Parliament from the research community. So in our session today, we are exploring select committee evidence. This is what we're planning to cover. I'll just give you a brief recap of the difference between Parliament and government, and then we're going to look at the use of evidence by select committees. We'll explore the role and work of specialist advisors, and we'll look at how you can contribute evidence as a researcher, particularly some tips on good written and good oral evidence. And we'll end by giving you a bit of information about what resources and support there are here for you. We do have a separate training session that you can access, a recording of it, which is all about what select committees are and how you work with select committees. What we're going to do with the session today is to build on that by digging down into what evidence is for select committees and how you as a researcher can contribute evidence and work with committees around the use of evidence. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by two of my colleagues from the Knowledge Exchange Unit, Sarah Foxon, who is going to be keeping an eye on your questions today and putting them to our speakers, and my colleague Laura Webb, who's helping in the background as well. And I'm really pleased that we've got some expert speakers for you today as well. So you'll be hearing from George James, who is a committee specialist for the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee in the House of Commons. You'll be hearing from Alex McMillan, who is a committee clerk in the House of Lords Select Committees team. And you'll be hearing from Janet Veitch, who is a specialist advisor for the Women and Equalities Select Committee in the House of Commons. So just before I hand over to the first of our wonderful speakers from Parliament then, I just wanted to refresh your knowledge about the difference between Parliament and government, because this is one of the really key things that we'd really like you all to understand. As you may well know, Parliament is all MPs, so it's the House of Commons. It is all members of the House of Lords, peers, and it is the monarch as well. And the UK government down the road in Whitehall is just some MPs and some peers who've been chosen by the Prime Minister to be ministers to run government departments and public services. And the really key thing here is that government is accountable to Parliament. So one of Parliament's main roles is to hold the government to account and to scrutinise the work of government. And select committees are a really key way that Parliament holds those government departments to account, scrutinises their work and their spending and their policies, and asks them to justify their actions and explain what they are doing. So now I've refreshed your knowledge about that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to our first speaker, who's going to talk to us a little bit about select committee evidence. I'm really pleased to introduce you to George James, and George is going to talk to you a little bit about what evidence is and how select committees use it. And then he'll hand over to the second of our speakers, Alex McMillan, to talk to you a little bit about how select committees find evidence and how they find people to talk to. So George, thank you so much, and Alex in advance, thank you as well. And I will hand straight over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Naomi. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit today about select committee evidence. It's a term worth defining because it's not necessarily intuitive for those of you who haven't engaged with Parliament before. So evidence is any contribution to a select committee inquiry that engages with the terms of reference of that inquiry. Now, an inquiry is a long form piece of work that a committee agrees to carry out. It could last several weeks or even several months. It focuses on a particular topic or a policy area. When a committee agrees an inquiry, it will publish a terms of reference, which is a set of questions that the committee wants to answer or points it would like to explore. And evidence is anything, any piece of written work or an oral contribution that speaks to those terms and tries to advance the committee's understanding of those questions or those points. So that goes to the second point on this slide. It needs to be relevant to the committee inquiry to be considered. One caveat is that evidence needs to be an original contribution. Now, that doesn't mean that we're asking you to conduct original research on behalf of the committee, although that would be very nice. I'm sure you don't have the time. But it does mean that if you do have research that you've already done that you want to share with us, we ask you to, in your submissions, tell us how it informs the terms of reference specifically. And there's a good reason for this that relates to parliamentary privilege that I'll return to in just a moment. But the thing to ultimately remember is that we're looking for an original submission when we call for evidence. So what happens to this evidence? Well, it's published online as part of the committee's inquiry. The committee will consider whether it wants to publish, and if it does, it will appear on our website. And the committees do this because they want to be able to point to contributions people have made and to justify the questions that they ask the ministers or the conclusions and recommendations that they draw from their reports. And they also want interested members of the public who might be following the inquiry to see how the committee has reasoned and how it has reached its conclusions. It is possible, if you would like to, or if you feel that there's a need to publish evidence anonymously or to have it redacted, or in some cases to have it circulated to the committee in confidence. Now, there may be good reasons for that, and if you think that that is something you would like to or need to do, then I would recommend that you speak to the committee clerk of the committee whose inquiry you're contributing to. But it is worth saying that committee's preference is wherever possible to be able to put something in the public domain. So when you are producing your evidence, try and bear in mind that the committee would ideally like to be able to publish it. I just want to come back to this point about parliamentary privilege. Anything that a committee receives as evidence and reports to the House is covered by parliamentary privilege, and that means that it's covered by the protection of freedom of speech that's given to all parliamentary proceedings. At the sharp end, that means that evidence that's given to Parliament cannot be admitted as evidence of an offence in court. Now, I'm guessing that most of the things you would want to submit to a committee won't engage privilege in that way, but it is worth noting that that protection is there, and that's what makes evidence, when published, distinct from other documents that might be put into the public domain by other organisations. And just to return to the point I was making earlier, this is the reason why we can't, unfortunately, accept existing papers. If something is already in the public domain, we're not able to give it the legal protection of privilege. So it's worth taking a step back at this point and asking, why do committees invite evidence in the first place? And there are several reasons why they might do so. So first is that they want to learn from a range of expertise and experiences. So select committees are carrying out their scrutiny functions on behalf of the whole of Parliament and indeed on behalf of the public at large, and they want to do that in the most informed way possible. Now, a select committee tends to have about 11 members, and although they know a lot about their subject area, they're not going to have the same depth of expertise on every inquiry as a researcher who makes a profession in that field or someone with a lifetime of experience in that field. Equally, you can imagine inquiries where the committee might not necessarily have the personal experience to inform the inquiry properly. For example, an inquiry into disability benefits, not every member of the committee will necessarily have experience of claiming those benefits or with engaging with that system. So what they do is they invite evidence from experts and people with the relevant experience to make sure that their questioning is as informed as possible. Another reason why they invite evidence is to make sure that their conclusions and their recommendations are as objective and as well reasoned as possible. Members don't simply want to assert an opinion, they don't want to assert a conclusion or a recommendation to government, they want to be able to justify it, and having your evidence and having it in the public domain where it can be viewed helps them to do that. Another reason why committees invite evidence is because it allows stakeholders to present information and opinion to government. Now, you'll probably know that government has any number of priorities and they're not always the same as yours, and it can be quite difficult sometimes to get your work to cut through. The great thing about select committee work is that government ministers are required to come and answer questions before the committee, and they are required to respond to committee reports. So by amassing expert opinion and contributions from far and wide, the committee is able to put those in a report to government and elicit a response, elicit a government position on something which it might not otherwise have volunteered. And in a similar vein, inquiries are a very good way of exploring and challenging current thinking. So I think I mentioned before that inquiries are quite long form as parliamentary procedure goes. If you've ever watched Prime Minister's Questions, you'll know that a question can sometimes be asked and answered in about 30 seconds, whereas inquiries can take months, and that's a very good opportunity for a committee to take a very considered look, bringing in expert testimony and people's experiences to really bottom out their thinking on a subject and challenge perhaps conventional wisdom in a way that other areas of parliamentary procedure aren't quite as well suited to do. So part of the reason why we're speaking to you today is because we want to encourage input into committee inquiries from as broad a range of contributors as possible, and this slide helps to illustrate a couple of ways in which we do that. The first thing to say is that committee inquiries are open to absolutely everyone. If a committee launches an inquiry on, say, nuclear decommissioning, it doesn't matter whether you are the country's foremost expert on nuclear decommissioning or just an interested layperson. You can go to that committee's inquiry, you can click on a button, and you can share your thoughts with the committee. There is no prerequisite whatsoever for engaging with committee inquiries. Another thing that's quite important is that committees have a different culture to other parts of parliamentary life. The culture of committees is one where members, when they walk into the committee room or the committee Zoom at the moment, they leave their party political hats at the door. Committees try to proceed on the basis of consensus, and they try to consider all perspectives, not just their own, not just those of their constituents, and not just those of their party. And so when a committee receives evidence, it isn't going to reject it based on whether or not it agrees with it. The expectation is that as much is put in the public domain as possible and that all perspectives are explored. It's worth caveating this slightly. I don't want to give the impression that committees simply unthinkingly accept and publish everything they receive. Evidence that committees receive is analysed by committee specialists. Every committee has its own staff who will look at evidence as it comes in. They'll pick out key points of interest to the committee, perhaps a particularly well-researched paper, a novel point, or just something of interest to the committee. And so in that way, we make sure that particularly valuable contributions do get the committee's attention and do get a public airing. I should also say that committees do have some discretion over what they publish. Now, as I mentioned before, the committee's attitude is to publish as wide a range of evidence as they possibly can, but there are some occasions on which they might decline to do so. That might be because either a piece of evidence is completely irrelevant to an inquiry, or it might be that, for example, it's considered an abuse of parliamentary privilege. So committees wouldn't want to, for example, give legal cover, the cover of privilege, to a submission which disclosed secure or personal information. So the thing to take away from this is that the process is very open and that committees do try and publish the broadest range of contributions possible, but it is just worth noting that that discretion is there. That's it from me for the moment. I'll now hand over to Alex, who can tell you a little bit more about which committees gather evidence.
Hi everyone, so I'm Alex. I'm a clerk in the committee office in the House of Lords. Clerk is a bit of a weird job title. It basically means that I head up the staff team that looks after a committee. I'm currently working on the COVID-19 committee, but I've worked on a number of different committees in the House of Lords. So I'm going to start by talking about how committees invite evidence, and particularly written evidence to start off with. Most committees will put out what they call a call for evidence, basically just saying, we've launched this inquiry, tell us what you think. Committees aren't obliged to do that. Not all committees will do that for every inquiry, but that's a typical thing that a committee would do. And that would appear on the committee's website, which would give details of the inquiry's terms of reference, any specific questions they're hoping people will answer. And committees will make quite a lot of effort to try and promote that call for evidence. So if they have a Twitter account, they'll typically post it on there. So following The Twitter accounts of committees that you're interested in is a good way of finding out what's going on. Some committees have mailing lists that you can subscribe to, although lots don't. And there's also a section on Parliament's website where you can find out about all the current inquiries going on in Parliament. And then committee staff will probably try and raise awareness of their call for evidence by doing things like putting out media releases, proactively reaching out to organisations who are likely to have expertise in that area, asking other teams in Parliament to help. So people like the Knowledge Exchange Unit, like Post, who some of you might have come across. We have a participation team that works a lot with kind of grassroots organisations, really trying to get details of inquiries out to their networks. So if you're thinking that engaging more with Parliament is something that you're interested in, you might want to think about how well networked you are with some of those mechanisms. When it comes to inviting oral evidence, it's a bit different in the sense that, as we've already heard, written evidence is open to anyone to submit, whereas oral evidence is decided by the committee. They'll make a decision about who they want to hear from. And the number of oral witnesses they can hear from is really limited. If you're only holding maybe 3 weeks of evidence sessions, you typically would only hear from 8 or 12 people. So there's a process for identifying suitable candidates, and that will vary significantly depending on the length of the inquiry, how the particular committee likes to work. In an ideal world, probably what would happen would be the call for written evidence would go out, would close, and then the committee would invite oral evidence witnesses based on people's written evidence contributions. But often committees are operating under pressure of time. That means that those two processes are going on simultaneously. So in reality, often what happens is members of the committee, so in my case, members of the House of Lords, make suggestions of people that they'd like to hear from. If the committee has a specialist advisor, and we'll hear a bit more about specialist advisors later on, they might suggest witnesses. But otherwise, it's basically left to the committee staff team to try and become aware of who might be good within the very limited time available. And sometimes it's obvious that certain organisations will have looked at a particular topic. Other potential witnesses tend to come to light as you're researching a topic. Maybe they're quoted in a news article, or they come up in a Google search, or they sit on a government advisory group that looks at these issues. Typically, I'll draw up a long list of potential candidates and then speak to each one, because what I'm trying to do is put together panels that can cover the range of issues we want to cover, not have witnesses that duplicate each other. So if we've already got one expert on one issue, we don't need a second expert on the same thing. We need people who are able to express themselves well. And ideally, we also want to hear from people we haven't heard from before in previous inquiries, for example. But I'm conscious that this does mean that there's a really big risk that we always hear from the usual suspects. And we do. We act both in the Commons and the Lords. It's a really big problem. One thing I do is try and ask larger organisations to recommend smaller organisations or individuals who I might not have heard of. But that brings me on to the sort of the third thing that I want to talk about, which is about witness diversity. We know that the pool of witnesses we hear from isn't diverse enough. It's true in the Commons, it's true in the Lords. And we really want to improve that, because hearing a range of viewpoints is critical to the committee getting the in-depth understanding of an issue that it needs. So in the Lords, before each inquiry, we now consider witness diversity as part of our planning process. So we think about what aspects of diversity are most relevant to the inquiry. So, for example, do we need to hear from both large and small organisations? Are different groups of people in different communities going to be affected by the same issue differently? And we think about how we're going to reach those groups. And that'll then determine what action we take. So we might decide to promote an inquiry through particular specialist channels. We might work with partner organisations to reach particular audiences. We might hold outreach events. My committee recently did big ones with groups of parents, for example, to hear from different groups of parents across the country facing different challenges. So that's really interesting. We also encourage organisations to consider who they're going to send to give evidence. So this is particularly true with oral evidence. Organisations have a really strong inclination to send their chief executives, and in many sectors that leads to all male, all white panels. So we're working really hard to try and ask organisations to consider who they're sending to give evidence. But maybe now is a good time to pause actually and to take some questions.
Thank you so much, George and Alex. Those were absolutely fascinating and really enriching contributions. We are massively overwhelmed with questions, so let's focus in on some which I think we've got common themes in them. So the first one, George, is for you, and I think you've piqued a lot of interest in the notion of parliamentary privilege. So we've got some questions. When you say evidence must be original, does that mean it can't have been published in a journal article or a book? And someone says, sorry, this might be a bit of a silly question. I can assure you there are no silly questions about parliamentary privilege. Everybody, it's very complicated, but sorry, this might be a silly question. But if we can't provide published sources due to parliamentary privilege, and we also don't need to do new research to answer the question, then where does the evidence come from? So could you help us unpick that a bit more, please?
Yeah, of course, and it's not a silly question at all. I think it's worth clarifying. My original remarks might not have necessarily been as clear as they ought to have been. So when I say a submission needs to be original, I'm referring to the document itself. So what we can't do is we can't take an actual paper that you've published and then publish it as evidence on the committee's website. We certainly can take a précis or a summary of that paper if you submit it to the committee and explain how it's relevant to the work that the committee is doing. So I don't want you to feel that you can't use any of your previous findings to inform what you say to a committee. All that we ask is that you don't simply send those papers over to us as they are.
So another question for you here. How do committees judge the quality of the evidence that is presented, and who advises them on this?
So as I said before, in terms of what committees decide to publish, the assumption is that they will publish as widely as possible. So a committee won't reject something simply because it disagrees with a submission. In terms of how they assess the quality, to some extent, that is up to the members themselves, what arguments they are convinced by. However, as I mentioned, committees do have specialist staff, and the House also has specialist staff, such as staff in the House of Commons Library, who will help to make an assessment of a piece of evidence. As for what committees then take forward in their questioning to ministers, and as to what conclusions they draw in their reports, that's really a matter of how convincing they find the arguments and how convincing they find the exploration of those arguments in the oral evidence sessions.
Got a question now for you, Alex, which is it possible to be proactive? So can I submit evidence to a select committee even if there is no call for evidence?
The short answer is probably no. The only real, evidence, it definitely wouldn't be evidence if there wasn't an inquiry going on. Sort of semantically, that wouldn't be the case. I suppose if what you're saying is, I'm aware of this really big issue that I think Parliament should be looking at, and it isn't, there isn't any harm in trying to engage with the staff of a committee and saying, look, I've got this really good idea for an inquiry. This is something that's really not been looked at in Parliament before, and I think it really should be. I know as a clerk, I really value those kind of discussions with experts. But if it's simply, I've published a paper recently and I really want everyone to know about it, so I'm going to email it to every committee in Parliament, that's really not helpful. So I think you need to think about what your motivation is, and I suppose what you're hoping to achieve from it. But it wouldn't be the case of making like a evidence submission. It might be more about starting a conversation with staff about an underexplored area that you think would be really relevant to the committee and really valuable to the kind of wider discourse going on.
I think we've probably got time for, let's try one more question, possibly two more. So next question is there a time limit for submitting evidence? What are the kind of windows, time frames for engaging with committees?
It completely depends on the inquiry. So basically all you need to do is look at the call for evidence and it will tell you when the deadline for submitting evidence is. Some of them are going to be very short and you'll have to be able to respond very, very quickly. Some of them are really long. It completely depends. So you'll just need to follow the advice that's given in that particular inquiry's call for evidence.
George and Alex, thank you so much for those contributions so far. We're coming back to you later for a little bit of more information. But before we do that, we thought it would be really interesting to explore the role and the work of specialist advisors. So George and Alex have both mentioned specialist advisors in what they've talked about in Select Committee evidence. And I'm really pleased that we've got today with us Janet Veitch, who is a specialist advisor with the Women and Equalities Committee. And Janet is going to speak to us about her role as a specialist advisor, and give you a bit of information about what she does in terms of evidence, and hopefully a bit of advice for anyone who's interested in that role. Janet, thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you for 10 minutes or so of your wisdom.
Thank you very much. I don't know about wisdom, but we'll see. Okay, so I have been lucky enough to be a specialist advisor on 2 inquiries for the Women and Equality Select Committee. That was on the Sustainable Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goal 5, and it being implemented in the UK, and the one that I'm currently advising on, which is the machinery of government that focuses on equalities and how effective it is. And I've also been an expert witness to another inquiry that they ran on the role of the Minister for Women and Equalities. And this has already been touched on a little bit today, but the role is essentially to supplement the expertise of the core staff who support the committee. So the core staff are expert in running inquiries, and they may well have expertise in the particular areas that the committee looks at, but they can't possibly be expert in every aspect of every policy area. So the role of a specialist advisor is to bring in that expertise. You might be an expert in the policy area itself, the substantive issues, but you'll certainly be aware of the key issues in the area and of the range of debate around those issues. And they're looking for expertise on the analysis, but also on possible solutions. So it's quite a practical, political kind of role. And this point about the range of the debate, I think, is a really important one, because the committee needs to be assured that it's covered all the angles. Almost the worst thing I would say a committee can be accused of is that it's taken a very narrow view about something and missed the point. And of course, as academic researchers, you're in a very good position to provide exactly what they need, because whatever your focal point of research, you will have read round it, you will understand what the alternative viewpoints are, and what the different arguments are, and the pros and cons, and that's exactly what the committee needs to hear. So just thinking in practical terms about the way it works, you've got a very good professional clerking team. They're going to draft the briefs for the committee that tell the committee what the key issues are, and you're going to advise on that. You're going to advise on the kind of questions they might want to put when they take oral evidence. You'll attend committee sessions when they meet to plan, and you'll also attend the witness hearings. Now that's changed a bit since we've moved on to Zoom, but essentially you're there throughout the whole thing. You might brief the committee in closed session if they need some background on the issues before they start to take evidence, and that might particularly apply if the members are new, or if it's an area that's new to them, they haven't looked at it before. And this has already been said as well, but remember that MPs don't have much time to become expert in everything the committee is looking at. So again, as a specialist advisor, you can play a crucial role in ensuring that all the key arguments are covered. In terms of your role in relation to evidence, you know, things like who sources the evidence, how is it read and evaluated? That's one of the things that a specialist advisor might help with. They might give advice on where evidence might be found. Again, that would be something you would be very valuable in doing. You might advise who might be invited to submit written evidence and oral evidence. So as has been said, and as you will know, it's all on the website, the invitation to submit written evidence and so on. But sometimes people don't see it, and there might be key stakeholders that the committee really needs to hear from, in which case you might advise on, you know, making sure that those people are included. And all of this is about ensuring the best quality and the widest evidence that's available. And the committee's time is obviously valuable, so it's really important that we make the best use of it. And then in terms of all the evidence that's submitted, it varies according to the inquiry, but you might get, in some cases, thousands of pieces of evidence. You might only get a smaller number. but specialist advisor would want to read the evidence that's submitted to get a sense of whether the key points are being covered. And a lot of the written evidence will just repeat itself. It's still valuable because it enables us to give the committee a sense of where the main focus of interest is. And it also helps us map the stakeholders, so the people who put in the evidence will be able to see how wide-ranging that is. Part of the point of the job is to be able to pull the critical points out of the debate and to be alert to the political dimension. So one of the things we're always thinking about is what solutions can be brought. And as researchers, your focus might be on the data and the analysis, but really we need to make that next step and think about what solutions might have political traction. So we're moving slightly beyond just the research itself and thinking about, okay, what could we pull out that might be practically useful for the committee? And you're in a really good position to advise about what represents a reasonable political compromise. So politicians might be required to make decisions about priorities and affordability. You will be able to say, if you make this compromise, you might miss the point. You might fail to solve the problem. And what you can also bring is a long-term view. Politicians are, of course, driven by immediate pressures, and you can take a longer-term view and warn them, alert them, if you think that they might be going to recommend something that might work in the short term, like an immediate response to the COVID pandemic, but might exacerbate problems, public policy problems in the long term. And then just thinking about the sorts of things that you might want to bear in mind, maybe like the 3 top tips, as it were. I suppose the things I would think about is really to take on the focus of your committee and your inquiry. What do they need? What do they want? If you think about their role and put yourself in their place, and you're meant to be advising them on how they can best do their role, carry out their role. Their key role is to scrutinise policy. So is it effective? You know, does it do what it says on the tin? Is it efficient? You know, is it the best value for money? Is the policy being done in the best way it could? Are we being accountable? Is it possible to scrutinise the policy given the amount of information that's in the public domain? So can Parliament hold government to account for what it's doing? Is it measurable? And how can it be improved? So you need to frame your advice to meet those committee needs. I guess I would also think about being simple, practical, relevant. When you're deep in research, as you are, sometimes you can use vocabulary that is opaque. The analysis may be very deep and may assume certain knowledge. The more simple you can be, the more practical and relevant you can be in the political context in which this public policy issue will land, the more you can reduce your comments to a succinct summary, the more useful it will be for the committee to be able to understand it. And of course, we're all, you know, when people are doing academic research, you're always thinking about what the impact, what the pathways to impact are, and how you can explain it in simple terms to the public. It's a very similar thing here. And I suppose my final thought would be to be concise, to move smoothly from analysis to solutions. So have specific examples for them that you think will work within the context that we're talking. And I suppose I really would like to emphasize finally that this is not about pushing a single view, but allowing the committee to see the range of arguments that exist in a particular area so that they can really understand what's going on, and they won't be criticised for having left something out or ignored something, ignored a really controversial area. They need to be able to get to grips with that, unpick it and understand so that they can make the best possible recommendations.
Great, a couple of questions for you. Firstly, a really practical one. Is it a paid role being a specialist advisor?
Yes, it is. Don't get overly excited because it's not the best paid job in the world. I would say Parliament still relies on the fact that it's seen as a prestigious thing to do. It's a good thing to have on your CV. So they don't pay a lot, but they do pay, yes.
One more question before we move on, which is, in your role as a specialist advisor, obviously you've engaged with a lot of academic literature or academic research as evidence, but what are some of the other sources of evidence that a specialist advisor would need to engage with?
You're expected to understand the broad arguments in the field, as I said. So think tanks, professional associations. So if you were doing an inquiry that was economic, then you would expect to look at the CBI's evidence, you would expect to look at TUC's evidence, and civil society organisations are always very important stakeholders as well. So if you were looking at a public service area, you'd be thinking about the people who deliver those services. They might be private businesses, they might be charities. And then there are the second tier organisations that represent those voices. So you need to have a broad view of what the key stakeholders are saying in the area, and those would be kind of the main ones.
I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Janet for that really interesting insight into your role, and some really interesting advice there as well for researchers who might be looking at that role or who might find themselves in that role as well. What we're going to do just for the last 20 minutes of our session is to have a think about how you as researchers, why you might want to give some evidence to a select committee, and then to unpick what good written evidence and what good oral evidence looks like. And we're going to leave you with some really practical tips about what you do from here. How do you find inquiries to submit evidence to, and what support is there for you to do that? So George, thank you so much. It is back over to you to tell us a bit about why researchers might want to do this.
Thanks, Naomi. Yeah, so we've spoken quite a bit already about what committees get out of your contributions, but let's talk a bit now about what you can get out of contributing. So the first thing to say is that when you contribute to a committee inquiry, that's all going towards proper scrutiny of government. So your evidence can help members or peers ask the right questions of ministers, and it can help them ask those questions in the right way and challenge government on its policy and its actions. And that's a very good way for you to put the points that you've been making in your research to ministers directly through the means of the committee, and to get government to answer those questions that you've always been asking. Committees do more than just ask questions, of course. They can also have an impact by making conclusions and recommendations that influence government policy. So a really convincing piece of research or evidence can result in the committee making a stronger recommendation that can cause government to change policy, or otherwise, even if government doesn't change policy, it can advance a debate or put your ideas out in the public domain where they can get some traction. It's also a good way for you to raise your personal profile. One way that might happen is that your work might be cited in a committee report, it might be quoted in a committee session or on the floor of the House. There's also a chance that you might be invited in on the strength of your written evidence to then give evidence in person. And that can help to, as I say, start a conversation or move a conversation along. It can help to establish you as a public contributor on the topic. And quite a lot of people who've given evidence to select committees have subsequently been invited to appear on panels or have been invited to comment on news items and things like that. So it's quite a good way to establish yourself as a known expert in your field. And finally, just to come back to the parliamentary privilege point, although in the majority of cases and with the kind of work that you're likely to be submitting, this isn't really going to be a concern for you, there are some quite a narrow range of inquiries where it is very important that your contribution will have that legal protection. You can imagine, for example, an inquiry into the conduct of a company, for example. There might be some things that you wouldn't want to put in a newspaper article, but which nevertheless need to be explored as part of the committee inquiry, and privilege allows that to happen. As I say, it's very rare, I think, for academic research to engage those kinds of questions, but it is worth keeping in mind. So I'll now hand back over to Alex, who can tell you a little bit more about how to make your contributions to committee's work most effective.
Great, thanks. Yes, so thinking about written evidence first, I would say, there's a few things. Firstly, make sure you directly address the terms of reference or the questions that the committee are asking. So make it very clear why what you're saying is relevant to what the committee is looking at. It's about what they want to look at, not what you want to look at. Keep it short and use language that's accessible to the general public. You're not writing for an expert academic audience. Imagine you're explaining it to a friend down the pub who has no knowledge of the subject matter. It's also helpful, and this goes back to something slightly that we were talking about earlier, to briefly explain why you know about this. We get pieces of evidence from Mr. Jones down the road, and we get pieces of evidence from people who've been studying this subject for 40 years. So it is worth briefly just helping us understand why you're a legitimate source. Don't feel the need to answer all of the questions in the terms of reference. Only talk about the ones that you know about and that you are expert in. The best evidence, in my opinion, is a mixture of some really hard facts and figures that the committee can quote from, and also some real world examples to help bring what you're saying to life. In some cases, that might be case studies of individuals. In some cases, it might be practical real world sort of implementation of what you're talking about, but help give us some colour and help us quote from you. Remember, what we're going to be doing as a staff team and as a committee is taking all this evidence and in most cases turning it into a report. Now, I guess from your point of view, ideally, your evidence ends up being quoted in that report. So make it easy. Make sure there's 1 or 2 sentences that we can just lift and use as a quote that'll sum up your key message. And also, as we said before, remember that the point of the committee's inquiry really is to come up with recommendations, and chiefly recommendations for government, the UK government. So if you can, include something that states clearly what you think the committee should be calling for. If you were the members, what would your recommendations to the UK government be on this? So turning then to oral evidence, I mean, a lot of those points are also true for oral evidence, but I'd start by saying if you're called to give oral evidence, the committee team will be very happy to talk you through how you should prepare. So take them up on that. And they'll also normally provide you with a list of likely questions in advance. Make sure you do prepare, okay? This is your chance to get your point across. So make sure you've watched previous evidence sessions they've held, read back the transcripts of previous sessions, spend the time thinking about what your key messages are going to be. And then when it comes to the day, be brief, be clear. Again, help us quote from you. Think about a few sound bites that we could easily lift out from a transcript and quote in a report. That mix of both hard facts and figures, real world examples, and your suggestions for committee recommendations. Only feel that you need to answer questions that you're expert on. Feel free to say, I don't know. If you don't know, you can offer to come back to the committee in writing as well with some more detail. Or if there's something that you can't remember, don't make up things on the spot. We have seen witnesses do that occasionally and they turn out nearly always to be wrong. Engage with what other witnesses have said. This doesn't have to be a back and forth dialogue. If another witness says something interesting that you want to pick up on, include that in your remarks. And it's fine to disagree with them. We like a lively debate. It's fine to disagree with what the members' propositions as well. And some committees will leave time at the end for you to add anything that you feel hasn't been covered. And if they don't, try and get that in anyway. And if you can't, at least follow up in writing. Again, it is worth bearing in mind that this is something you might be really expert in and that the members really aren't, and that the staff writing the questions for the members really aren't. So they might not always ask the right questions. Feel free to be clear what you think the most important point is, as long as it's within the terms of reference.
Alex, thank you so much, and George, for some more snippets of really useful advice there about contributing evidence. We're going to come back to you, Alex and George, for some more questions in a moment. Before we do that, I realise that we've talked a lot about how select committees are using evidence and giving you some really good advice about how that evidence is being used and how you might want to present it. But I wanted to take a brief step back and give you some practical tips about how you might actually find those inquiries in the first place, and the kind of key ways that you can actually get involved with committees. Alex mentioned this when she was talking about how committees find written evidence, But if you are on Twitter, then most select committees are now on Twitter, and they will put on their Twitter feed any new inquiry that they are running and that they would like evidence on. So I'd really recommend that you have a look at the list of select committees and follow any which you are interested in or which you feel you might be able to contribute to. If you're not on Twitter, you can sign up for email alerts via the Parliament website, and you can sign up for alerts on policy areas that your research may feed into. And that just means that you'll be getting information from those committees and calls for evidence from those committees. Some committees also kind of run an email list where they will email out new inquiries to their email list. So it's always worth getting in touch with a committee directly to ask if they've got an email list that you could be part of. And that just means you can keep abreast of what inquiries are going on. And then if there is an inquiry you feel you can contribute to, you've got it right there in your inbox or on your Twitter feed. So if you do see an inquiry that you think, actually, I've got something to say about that, even if it's just one or two of the questions in the terms of reference, then do submit some written evidence. You've just had some great tips from Alex there about how to make your written evidence really useful and usable. And that might lead to an invitation to come and give some oral evidence to a committee. There's not really a hierarchy of what's better, written or oral evidence. So don't feel that it's the aim to get to the oral evidence. Written evidence can be incredibly useful to clerks, to specialist advisors, to committee specialists to use. If you see any opportunities to be a specialist advisor, we'd really encourage you to apply. Hopefully, the information we've heard from Janet today has inspired you a bit that that's a really interesting role, a very influential role in terms of shaping how the committee use evidence and the points that that they're taking forward. And a final kind of tip, if you want to be even more proactive about getting involved with a select committee, is if a committee is running an inquiry that you feel your institution or your research centre or team has something really relevant and pertinent to that inquiry, get in touch with that select committee and you can offer to host a visit, probably a virtual one at the moment, a visit for that inquiry, perhaps a round table or a briefing with some experts from your institution, and just to give a bit more information and flavour. And that kind of offer, as Alex mentioned about being proactive and starting that conversation with the committee, that kind of offer could be really valuable in terms of building a relationship with that committee or getting really involved with that particular inquiry, making sure that the evidence and expertise you've got is feeding in. So that's a few tips for you. We have got a few minutes left for some final questions. So we're going to go back over to Sarah, who has been keeping an eye on the many questions you've been sending in, to see which one she would like to put to our speakers.
Thanks very much, Naomi. Yeah, loads of questions. First question is for you, George. So you were talking about why a researcher might want to engage with Parliament, and it's so they can have an impact with their research is one of those main motivations. But how can we go about determining whether a researcher has had impact? I know it's a really difficult question, but is there a way to trace the impact of a piece of research or a piece of evidence, or even the impact of a committee inquiry?
It's a very good question. So the main way of doing that is probably through a committee's report. So at the end of an inquiry, a committee will normally publish a report collating its findings and putting some conclusions and points for action to the government. It's quite common for those reports to quote extensively from the evidence that the committee's received, and those and contributions are all referenced. So you'll be able to see if you go and read that report that your submissions will be cited, or your oral evidence to the committee will be cited. In terms of tracking the impact of committees' work, the government, as I say, is required to respond to all committee recommendations, and that response normally comes out about 6 to 8 weeks after the report. You can see whether government has taken those recommendations on board. So that's a good way to track whether the inquiry and whether your contributions to the inquiry have ultimately had an impact.
Next question is for you, Alex. So question for you is, On average, how many written submissions would you expect to receive? So could you give us a bit of an idea of what a specialist would be facing, or what a clerk would be facing, and how one person's evidence submission might sit within the wider kind of body of sources that are submitted?
Yeah, again, it really varies. I've done some incredibly specialist inquiries where you might only have a handful of pieces of written evidence. I've done some short inquiries where we haven't actually had a call for written evidence. We might just invite a couple of very specialist organisations to provide specific details that we want. On the other hand, if you're covering a topic that has very wide public interest, and I've certainly seen some of this on my current committee, which is looking at aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of responses, many of which will be from members of the public, which might only be a paragraph or so. And in fact, we've also done some inquiries where we've really proactively encouraged people to get involved in more non-traditional ways. So people sending in videos and poems and creative responses. But in terms of what that might mean for like the sort of the competition, if you like, and how your evidence might sit with that. Yeah, I think it's just going back to those points we've said before, that it's really make it easy for us. We're inundated. So make it your points really clear, really specific, really sort of pop and stand out. Just like, you know, I want to see like in the first couple of paragraphs why this is going to be really interesting and relevant for me. If it's like 25 pages of really complex text, it's going to be a real challenge for us to really understand what you're trying to say.
Naomi, I'll hand back over to you, but Naomi, could I just leave you with one last question, because so many people have asked it, and it's thanks to Janet's presentation. How do we become specialist advisors? Can you give us some ideas around how people can find out about those roles as you close, please, Naomi?
I'm really pleased that Janet has inspired so many people to want to do this role. That's absolutely great. So committees will sometimes advertise for specialist advisors on their websites. If you are on those email mailing lists for particular committees, then you will get those job adverts. They're quite often on the UK Parliament job pages as well. When we find them on Twitter, we will retweet any special advisor job we find, because we know they're of real interest to researchers. So if you're not following us on Twitter, please make sure that you are, if you're on Twitter. This is our Twitter handle here. It's at UKParl_research. And the other way that you might want to think about keeping an eye out for those special advisor jobs is to be in contact with any committees that are particularly within your field of expertise. So as I mentioned earlier, contacting that committee and just asking them if they've got an email distribution list, because that means they will certainly be promoting those special advisor roles as widely as possible. If you've submitted written evidence to them before, and they will know you, so that first step of submitting written evidence is a good way of starting a relationship if you don't want to just do a cold call for them. Just keep an eye out for any relevant inquiries and submit some written evidence, and you can start to build your relationship with the committee that way. But certainly keep an eye on our Twitter feed if you are on Twitter, and make sure that you check committee web pages as much as you can as well, because that will be where new inquiries and special advisor roles will be. I promised you a little bit more information about support and resources to help you do all of this these amazing actions that we're suggesting that you do. We have lots of online resources on our web hub for researchers, which is parliament.uk/research-impact. There's some how-to guides on there about how to give evidence to select committees. There's also some really clear information about how you find select committees relevant to you and how you follow them to make sure you're spotting those inquiries as they come up. Follow us on Twitter, as I've mentioned. If you've got any questions we didn't get to answer today, or you think of anything that you would like to know, please feel free to get in touch with us, the Knowledge Exchange Unit. That's me, it's Sarah who you've met asking your questions, and it's Laura who's been behind the scenes as well. We are KEU, Knowledge Exchange Unit, KEU at parliament.uk. So feel free to get in touch with us for any more information and questions. We'd like to thank you enormously for joining us for the hour this afternoon. Thank you so much again to our speakers. Thank you, George. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Janet. Really appreciate your time and your expertise and the advice and wise words you've given us today. Thank you to you for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.